I never expected to unlock a rusted garage door with a key that looked like a forgotten promise and feel my life unspool into something I did not recognize. It was a damp morning in late autumn, and the smell of cold metal and old oil rose up from the concrete as if the air itself were keeping a secret. 3 weeks after Edward died, after the funeral flowers had browned and the kitchen sinks were still full of souvenir cups from relatives I barely remembered, I found myself standing outside a low brick building on a side street, gripping a small envelope that said only my name in his careful block letters. My son Michael had been blunt at the attorney's reading. He had squeezed his jaw and said out loud what everyone else seemed to think quietly at the sides of their mouths. "You are past your use." I had carried that phrase with me. My hands trembled as I fit the key into a lock that had not turned since I can't remember when. What was left for me after 43 years with Edward and a life that had felt predictable and safe? Would a garage hold only inert things, or would it hold evidence that everything I thought I knew was arranged intentionally around my future? Let me go back and explain how I arrived at that doorway. I was 59 when Edward and I moved into the city apartment where we raised Michael. I had been a high school English teacher and later a small bookshop manager, people who trusted the slow accumulation of pages and modest profits. Edward worked in publishing and traveled in ways that made him both charming and remote. Our marriage was steady in ways that mattered and small in ways that erode over decades. We ate dinner together when schedules allowed. We argued about money rarely because Edward preferred to avoid the details and I preferred to keep the receipts. For most of our lives, I was the one who remembered birthdays and took care of doctor's appointments. When Michael left for college, I thought the gaps would be filled with travel and the books Edward and I would finally read together. Instead, Edward took to whispers about plans he would make after he was gone. He used the word legacy in a way that felt oddly clinical. I did not know then that his silence was an architecture. There were things about Edward that I hid under ordinary explanations because it felt less like betrayal and more like a mystery to be tolerated. He had a workshop in the back of the garage at the house we sold years before without telling me. He kept lists of model numbers and auction houses, and he had a penmanship for addresses that belonged to other names and other streets. Sometimes he would wake in the night and write in a leather notebook. When I asked, he would smile and say it was research for a book he hoped to edit. I believed him in the way one believes a spouse until the belief is no longer adequate. Those quiet notes of his struck me in the months after his diagnosis as both ominous and meticulous. He had no estrangement with money in the dramatic way some men do. He was prudent, secretive, and oddly gentle about keeping me at a distance from details that ultimately mattered. On the day of the reading of the will, the attorney's office smelled of coffee and new legal pads. Marcus Levin, a man with steel-framed glasses and the kind of voice that fills rooms with neutral facts, cleared his throat and began. There were at least a dozen of us in the paneled conference room. Michael sat at the head of the table and kept his hands flat as if on a map. Patricia, Edward's longtime assistant, folded her hands on a laminated folder that held receipts and sketches. Other faces watched me like weather. Marcus read with an evenness that made each sentence feel like a verdict. The apartment downtown had gone to Michael. The summer cottage on the coast had been bequeathed to a local charity under a condition that it must be used for a writer's residency. The watch collection I had never seen was divided among 3 auction houses. Then Marcus said, and my voice remembers this part more as an echo than as a sentence, "There is a clause naming a property and a locked storage unit to be opened by the surviving spouse under specific conditions." The room inhaled. Michael said, "You are joking, Mom." I said nothing. When he turned to me, he did not touch my arm. His eyes were cool, and there was a clarity to his anger that felt enormous. "You should leave now," he told me later in the elevator with precise cruelty. Leaving was a favor. There were words exchanged in that conference room that later circulated as versions of truth. I remember Patricia leaning in and whispering, "You deserve better." I remember Margaret, the neighbor from the coast, saying, "Edward always did things in his own time." I remember Howard, an old college friend who had attended with a limp and a laugh that could have filled the better parts of a bar, murmuring, "Edward was always strategic." The fact of the storage unit clause felt like a slight because the public reading had given Michael the apartment and me what could be read as a token gesture. The word token sat on my chest the way an unshrugged sweater might. Driving away from the attorney's office, the city felt like a body with something removed. The apartment that had looked like a victory for Michael looked like a stage set to me. I had a key and an address scribbled on a Post-it. The storage facility was on a narrow industrial, a place where the air tasted faintly of rubber and the sky seemed low. The fluorescent lights hummed and the smell of motor oil and dust wrapped around my coat. When I turned the key, the door hissed open. For a second, the interior seemed smaller than I had imagined, because having expected boxes and old furniture, my chest tightened at the possibility of humiliation. There was a hush, as if the room itself waited for permission to reveal something. I switched on my small flashlight. It threw a cone of light that cut through dust motes hovering like slow planets. At the far side of the unit was something that did not belong amidst cardboard boxes and a folding lawn chair. Under a tarpaulin, there was the outline of a car. The fabric was thick, and the smell beneath it was not only of oil, but of leather and polish and a sweetness that reminded me of summer drives decades before. My hand shook as I lifted the cover. Metal glinted. Chrome caught the light and sent it back as a soft glare. It was a car I had only ever seen in magazines, a convertible with a winged hood and an interior red like a stopped heartbeat. Beneath the steering wheel, on the passenger seat, there was an envelope. It had my name and nothing else. The paper crinkled like old coins when I opened it. The letter was in Edward's handwriting, the same block letters that had written our mortgage checks and birthday notes. He had written simple sentences addressed to me and to no one else. He explained, in a voice that was both apologetic and deliberate, that he had kept this place secret because he feared conversation would become a negotiation, and that some things age better when moved with care. He wrote about the car and about several accounts and a directive that would fold these things together in ways that made him uneasy about being explained in public. He instructed me to have 3 people present, the attorney Marcus, a financial advisor named Patricia, and a family friend called Howard when I opened the safe he had arranged for me to find inside the trunk. There was a key taped to the inside of the envelope and a sentence that felt like a map to the rest of his intention. I wanted you to have choices. The letter was small but heavy, and when I read it, I felt both seen and excluded in equal measure. Before I go further, I need to pause and ask you something, because I know many of you watching have lived a version of being overlooked or underestimated. Share the moment you were most surprised by a family member in the comments. Start your line with "my surprise" and then a single sentence. I read these. I pick some to respond to because these stories are how we learn that none of us walk through these labyrinths alone. If you are not comfortable writing there, consider just writing "I forgave" or "I questioned." Either way, your words matter. The trunk of the car hid a compartment in a way I had not expected. The smell was of wax and old leather and a hint of citrus polish. I found a small metal safe bolted to the floor. When I opened it, there was a packet of documents, a fat portfolio bound in blue, and a ring box like the ones used for heirloom jewelry. The portfolio contained a trust instrument that named me as the primary beneficiary of a set of accounts and properties and spelled out conditions that read as both practical and protective. They were appraisals for artworks, a portfolio of stocks and bonds, and a letter from a man named Thomas Reed, a curator at a regional museum who verified a modest collection of paintings that Edward had purchased quietly over 3 decades. The ring box held a simple key. The documents had clauses I had never seen spelled out in such technical terms before. They suggested that Edward had prepared a plan that balanced public perception with private security. It became clear his decision to leave me the garage and not the apartment was intentional. It was a mechanism to force an active choice on my part to step into a role rather than simply be given something by default. Inside one page, Edward recounted in a brief paragraph his reasoning for cloaking these things in silence. He feared that if he told anyone outright, their kindness would become strings in the hands of others. He feared pity more than anything, he wrote. He wanted to ensure that I would have the means to continue living well, but also to decide how to live. The letter was both a balm and a blade. I loved him and I felt anger at the exclusion, but I also felt a sudden responsibility to become fluent in the instruments he had left. In the safe was also a list of names, a set of phone numbers, and a voucher for an appraisal that would require me to travel. It is important here to explain briefly what this kind of trust and portfolio structure can mean in practical terms. A trust is a legal arrangement where assets are managed by a trustee according to instructions laid out by the person who created it, the grantor. Trusts can be revocable or irrevocable, and they often contain clauses that specify when and how beneficiaries receive funds or benefits. Edward had used a type of lifetime trust that allowed him to direct management and distribution while maintaining a level of privacy. The portfolio included a designation of an independent trustee, a list of accounts with limited powers, and an instruction that certain assets be liquidated only after professional appraisal. This process involves valuations, tax assessments, and sometimes escrow arrangements, all coordinated through legal counsel and a financial firm. It is not fast, and it is not simple, but it can protect beneficiaries from impulsive claims and public disputes if drafted carefully. The day after the discovery, I called Marcus and set up a meeting. Marcus's office smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner. He wore a navy suit and a face that registered surprise with an efficient calm. Patricia came to the meeting as Edward had asked to help translate the investment language into something I could act upon. Howard arrived because he had been at our wedding and because Edward had considered him a man whose presence lent continuity. There were at least 8 direct turns in the conversation as we parsed the trust documents, and each turn deepened my sense that I was entering unfamiliar territory. I said I had found a car and a safe, and Marcus read aloud the clause that named me as the surviving spouse and gave me power to appoint an administrator for certain assets. Patricia explained line by line what liquidation would involve, and Howard kept asking what I wanted. It was a conversation where silence had as much meaning as words, and the exchanges felt like a negotiation where I was the pivot. Patricia asked how soon I intended to access the accounts. I said I did not know. Marcus explained fees and timelines, and that certain investments would require 3 to 6 months to untangle. Howard suggested we consider keeping the car and perhaps establishing a small trust fund for discretionary spending. I listened and asked questions and wrote on the legal pad with a pencil that left deep marks. At one point, Marcus said plainly, "You are the person in charge of the next steps, but you do not have to do this alone." Patricia said, "I can help you choose a certified appraiser." Howard offered to help with logistics. There were 9 exchanges in that meeting, each one clarifying a different risk or a procedural step, every one of them making the stakes more tangible. The technical part of the meeting required a short, detailed explanation about appraisals and estate tax implications. When artworks or vehicles are transferred, they must be appraised by certified professionals. The appraiser prepares a written valuation that is used by trustees, attorneys, and tax authorities. If the valuation is challenged, It can trigger a secondary review and potential tax reassessment. There are also costs associated with storage, conservation, and insurance, which must be factored into the decision to sell or keep an asset. Given the ostensible value of the car and the paintings, Edward had left an instruction that nothing be auctioned without a minimum reserve and a heritage clause that allowed the museum to purchase at a preferred price. That clause is often used to preserve cultural value while ensuring fair market transactions. After the meeting, I went to the cottage that Edward had purchased years before as an escape. It was a small house on a cliffside. The kind of place whose windows always seemed to look like frames. The smell there was salt and old wood and something floral that came from the potted geraniums on the sill. I slept with the letter on the bedside table and read it until the words blurred into a kind of litany. The cottage had a narrow driveway and a neighbor named Diane who waved from a yard that smelled like rosemary. Diane knocked on my door and brought a pie. She asked me if I was all right, and I said yes, and then no, and then perhaps. She told me a story about Edward bringing over a box of books once and leaving them with her for safekeeping while he sorted things. The neighbor's familiarity felt like a small island of normality in a sea of legal paperwork. There was a peacefulness to the cottage that made confrontation more possible rather than less. Michael arrived the next day with a duffel bag and a face like a closed book. He had not come to the reading at the attorney's office, but he had appeared at the cottage with the bluntness of someone who believed he was owed explanation. Our first exchange was short and sharp. He said, "Mom, why did you go through his things? Why did you go to that storage unit?" I said softly, "Because he left me a key, because he wanted me to find it, and he wanted me to decide." He said, "You are not thinking straight." He said, "You sound like you are trying to justify theft." I said calmly, "I am not stealing. I found what he left for me." He said, "Did he tell you to take anything else?" And I said no. The conversation kept stretching and folding. There were at least 10 direct back and forths in those first 2 hours, each revealing an assumption about who deserved what in the absence of someone to make decisions. Michael accused Edward of selfishness and accused me of betraying the family narrative. I accused him of cruelty in his public stance at the reading and of forgetting the times Edward had been generous in small ways. The words between us were sharp pieces of a breaking. At one point, he asked why Edward would hide things from him, and I asked why he assumed the universe should be arranged to his convenience. He said, "You are always on your own." I said, "Not this time, not if we can find a way to make this right." He called me sentimental. I called him hasty. Our voices rose a few times, then dropped into sullen quiet. When he left, he slammed the door, but not before pausing in the hallway to say in a quieter voice that he only wanted what he thought was his. I watched him go and felt the clean ache of an absence becoming something new. Over the next week, I met with a financial advisor named Louis and with Thomas, the curator, on the phone in a conversation that included descriptions of provenance, shipping costs, and condition reports. Louis explained patiently that the portfolio would need diversification and that selling some assets could create liquidity while preserving other pieces that held sentimental value. Thomas spoke about the paintings with a scholar's precision and asked for photographs and for the names of previous owners. I spoke with an appraiser named Anna, who asked me to close my eyes and describe each object from the car's engine to the smell of the leather seats. She made notes about cracks in varnish, about patina, and about market trends. The process felt slow and exacting, but necessary. Each technical step added a layer of bureaucracy that also served as a buffer against impulsive family claims. One afternoon, Marcus called to say there was a procedural complication. An old unpaid tax lien on one of Edward's former businesses had resurfaced, and the trustees needed to determine whether the lien applied to the assets in the trust. Patricia and Marcus walked me through the potential outcomes and the timelines. If the lien was enforceable, some assets might need to be liquidated to satisfy claims. If not, we could proceed with scheduled appraisals and potential sales. The explanation was clear and concise and took about 300 characters worth of detail to outline the mechanism, fees, and timeframes it would involve. It was the kind of thing that felt bureaucratic in text and existential in feeling. As the appraisals progressed, it became evident that some of Edward's secret purchases were more than sentimental trinkets. The car was valued at a mid-six-figure amount after a careful inspection, and several paintings had provenance lines that suggested they could be of interest to regional museums. Thomas called and said there were elements of one painter's brushwork consistent with an artist whose work had been misattributed in the past. If confirmed, that painting alone could change the tax liabilities and the distribution strategy. When I heard the numbers, my stomach curled with the odd sensation of both relief and vertigo. Money can solve certain problems and complicate others. It was the beginning of a cascade of small decisions. The confrontation that followed in the cottage is one of the moments I replay often because it was where private motives and public expectations clashed in a way that forced truth out of softer surfaces. Michael returned with a friend named Thomas, not the curator, but a tall man who worked in real estate and who brought a kind of practical bluntness to the room. He and Michael had a set of assumptions about what should happen with the car and the money. I had my list of what Edward had left and my sense of stewardship. The conversation moved quickly and then stalled and then reopened. Michael asked again why Edward would do this, and I read Edward's letter passages that spoke about protection and autonomy. There were at least 9 exchanges that evening, each like a circuit testing the limits of what we would accept. Michael accused me of wanting to live in a fantasy of romantic objects. I said I wanted to honor his father's intent. He said that was an excuse for not sharing and for hoarding. I said Edward had a reason, and that reason included fear of pity and fear of bargaining. At one point, Thomas said, "You could sell the car and split the proceeds between you both." And I said, "Perhaps, but not without considering the legal constraints Edward had placed." He said, "Lawyers can be persuaded." I said, "Perhaps, but persuasion is not the same as intention." The air in the room was the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace and a faint perfume that lingered in Michael's coat from the city. The sensory details of the evening made the conversation feel less abstract and more tangible. There were 3 clear moments of tension that week that demanded paragraphs of their own. The first happened when the museum called to request a conditional purchase. They asked for exclusive negotiation rights and presented a letter of intent. The second happened when an anonymous bid appeared for one of the paintings that was suspiciously timed and underpriced. The third happened when Michael sent an email to Marcus questioning the authenticity of the appraisal. Each of those moments escalated as new facts arrived, and each required careful 2 to 3 paragraph development to capture meaning and consequence. In the museum inquiry, the smell of old wood and paper in Thomas's office became part of the narrative because he had a stack of catalogs and the sunlight caught dust like a constellation. The anonymous bid felt like salt in an open wound because the timing suggested pressure was being applied. The email from Michael struck like a cold draft because it suggested trust was eroding. We negotiated. There were months of it. Patricia helped me draft a proposal to the museum that allowed them a first right of refusal, but also required them to match an independent appraisal. Marcus advised on an escrow arrangement so that proceeds would be held until liens were confirmed or dismissed. The language of those negotiations was precise and often slow. I learned to ask for what I wanted in ways that did not look like demands. I learned that saying "I need time to consider" can be as powerful as stating legal clauses. Financially, we set up an initial liquidity plan that allowed me to pay any short-term obligations and to hire a conservator for the paintings. Luis recommended a staggered sales strategy to avoid flooding the market. The process was meticulous, and 250 to 350 characters worth of explanation could not cover the emotional weight it carried. It was in the middle of these steps that I began to understand the degree to which Edward had orchestrated the outcome to force me into action. Leaving me a garage was not an insult, it was a nudge. He had created circumstances that would require me to step forward to protect the assets he considered important and to protect myself from the family assumptions that often follow death. I thought about all the mornings he had gotten up early to go to auctions and all the times he had wrapped parcels in newspaper and left them in the back of the car. I thought about the small acts of care he had taken and the decisions he had made in silence. The truth was complicated. I was angry and grateful in equal measure. At a certain point, Michael and I reached an impasse where words alone would not suffice. He wanted the apartment and a greater share of the liquid accounts, and he pressed for immediate sales. I wanted to follow Edward's instructions and to preserve certain pieces for possible donation. We did what families do when they cannot agree. We invited a mediator. Diane suggested a woman she knew named Margaret who had mediated community disputes. Margaret listened and then structured a session where each of us would speak in turn. The session had at least 8 direct turns between us and the mediator guiding with questions that forced us to speak not just about money, but about meaning. Michael spoke about fairness and his fear of being left behind. I spoke about dignity and about my fear of being reduced to an object of pity. The mediator asked us to list values we wanted to preserve and to create a shared statement about Edward's legacy. It was painful and clarifying. One day in late spring, a decision was made that surprised everyone. The museum confirmed that a painting likely attributed to a significant regional artist was indeed authentic after a cluster of technical tests, including infrared reflectography and pigment analysis, were completed. Thomas sent the report in an email that started with an exclamation point and ended with a restraint that felt like joy. That painting alone, if sold to the museum, would create a fund large enough to cover the liens and to provide a trust income that would allow me to remain in the cottage if I chose to do so, and to create a small scholarship in Edward's name. It was an outcome that blended practical consequence with an emotional arc that Edward, with his quiet mind, might have approved. The painting's verification felt like the moment when a complicated puzzle finally displayed a picture. In the weeks after the appraisal changed status, Michael and I sat down at the kitchen table where the smell of coffee and citrus from a lemon cake we were sharing made the air less brittle. The conversation was longer and gentler than most we had had in months. He said, "I did not know he would do this." He said, "I thought he resented me." I said he had reasons for silence and that those reasons were not simply spiteful. We had at least 10 exchanges that afternoon in which we worked through memory and hypothesis until the rawness of accusation softened into something resembling curiosity. He admitted that he had been afraid of losing the narrative he had built about our family, and I admitted that I had been afraid of becoming small. When he reached for my hand, it felt like the beginning of a new contract. The practical reallocation of assets took time. Margaret facilitated a mediated agreement that allowed Michael a greater share of liquid assets in exchange for preserving 2 works from the collection for possible donation. We set up a limited power of attorney for certain transactions and appointed an independent trustee to oversee the distribution and to ensure that the terms Edward had written were honored. The paperwork included a set of contingencies for tax liabilities and a clause that allowed for community input on the creation of the writer's residency at the cottage. Marcus filed the appropriate motion with the probate court, and the judge issued a provisional order that recognized the trust's directives and placed a temporary stay on any immediate dispersal of the collection pending final appraisals. It was legal choreography that required patience and trust in process. There were 3 decisive moments as the story reached a climax. The first came when the anonymous bidder withdrew his offer, and an investigation traced the advance to a dealer who had been known to manipulate auctions. The second came when the tax lien was resolved in a negotiated settlement that preserved most of the trust assets. The third came when the museum signed a purchase agreement for the painting at the appraised value and agreed to fund a modest writer's residency in Edward's name. Each of these moments required sustained attention and action, and they each produced an audible exhale in the small rooms where we gathered. In the end, I made choices that were both practical and tender. I kept the car for a season and drove it slowly along the coast while I sorted through what it meant to be myself without partnering in ways that had become unexamined. I approved the sale of 2 lesser works and placed the proceeds in a managed account that yielded an income allowing me to pay for repairs and a conservator. We established the residency at the cottage with guidelines that protected both the artists and the property. Michael received the downtown apartment and a significant portion of the liquid assets after we agreed on a staggered schedule to avoid market shocks. The trust remained intact, and the independent trustee made distributions according to Edward's instruction, which protected the assets from hasty claims. A month after everything started to settle, I sat on the cottage, a small porch, and watched a gull balance itself against a wind line that smelled of salt and pine. The garden was a sprawl of rosemary and a single hydrangea that had weathered winter. I had paid the conservator and signed the loan agreement for temporary funds to complete a protective roof repair. I had met with the curator to set the framework for the residency, which would begin accepting applications in the fall. I felt a strange new steadiness. Emotionally, I was walking through the first month of acceptance. The practicalities were firm enough that I no longer woke at night with the sharpness of immediate fear. I had arranged for monthly distributions, and I had begun to see myself in the documents as a person with choices rather than as an object to be divided. I kept a small framed photograph of Edward on a windowsill, and sometimes I would read aloud a line from his letter that ended with, "I wanted you to have choices." 3 months later, the residency committee had convened for the first time, and we had received over 100 applications. The museum had completed the acquisition and had invited me to the opening, where a small plaque acknowledged Edward's role in the donation. Michael and I had a dinner with Marcus and Patricia, where we laughed about the absurdities of probate and the way legal hearings can feel like theater. Our conversation was lighter than it had been in months, and our exchanges were grounded in new routines. I had begun to write again, short letters to friends about the books I was reading and notes for the residency's reading list. Financially, the managed account had stabilized, and I had made a small bequest to Diane for her kindness. I felt the slow work of rebuilding identity after loss. It did not erase the grief. It layered it with new textures. 6 months after the garage's door opened, my life had altered in ways I had not predicted. The writer's residency had its first resident, a young poet from a city 2 states away who baked bread and made maps of the coast in his spare time. The cottage had a new railing on the porch and a small plaque. Michael and I had visited a gallery opening together and had spoken publicly about family legacies in a way that felt honest rather than performative. There were still things to settle, like tax filings and final appraisals, but the big arcs had resolved in ways that allowed me to breathe. I drove the car sometimes with a thermos of tea and a scarf and felt the rush of wind as an affirmation of mobility rather than an attempt to cling to an image. I had also established a small fund for writers over 60 because I understood how voices can be overlooked by systems that prefer novelty. Looking back, I can say a few things with a steadiness that I did not have at first. Edward's secrecy was not only selfishness, it was his method of protecting me from the corrosive effects of public bargaining and from the guardrails of pity. He had built a structure that required me to act, and in that insistence there was a gift. The object, he left the car, the paintings, the small safe, were not simply investments. They were a mechanism for provocation and for trust. They forced conversations and they forced me to step forward. The outcome was messy and redemptive in parts, and I do not pretend it was easy. If this story resonated or stirred something in you, please leave a comment starting with "my surprise" and tell us briefly what you discovered about a family member when you least expected it. If you prefer to share how you reacted, write "I forgave" or "I set boundaries." I read these messages and will select some to feature in future conversations because hearing how other people shape their responses can be a guidepost. If you found value in the way we unpacked trusts, appraisals, and the difficult mathematics of grief, please consider subscribing for more stories that mix practical steps with human consequence. We bring on experts and real people, and we try to make complexity feel less secret. There were lessons that did not fit neatly into legal language. I learned how to ask questions with patience and with curiosity. I learned that a legacy can be both blunt and tender, and that what appears as exclusion can sometimes mask an intent to empower. I learned that the work of deciding in the wake of someone's life is as much about identity as it is about dollars. Most of all, I learned that the things we leave behind can be invitations to transform how we live rather than simply to continue living old patterns. The key that turned the lock opened more than a garage door. It opened a set of choices and a conversation and, eventually, a path forward. If you are standing before a locked door in your own life, know that you are allowed to ask for help, to read the map, and to choose how to carry what you inherit. For me, the surprising truth was that being left a garage was less about worth and more about work. Edward had given me an assignment and the materials to do it. I did not do it perfectly. I did it with mistakes and with help and with stubbornness. I did it into a life that feels as though it belongs to me again. If this story moved you, please subscribe to hear more accounts of people who navigated inheritances, secrets, and unexpected freedoms. And remember to leave a comment beginning with "My surprise" to share a single sentence of what you learned from someone unexpectedly. Thank you for listening and for being part of a community that believes stories can teach us how to act and how to forgive. A key had opened a door, and that door led me back to myself.